This one's a goner, too. You can see it in their eyes. What is this stuff?
Never mind that. Just dump it.
September 21st, 1945. That was the night I died.
Ladies and gents, I present to you one of the strangest double billings in film history. Grave of the Fireflies and My Neighbor Totoro, which were completed around the same time and screened as a double feature in theaters all across Japan. Strange juxtaposition? Definitely, but successful? Yes and no. The films were lauded by critics and audiences alike, but didn't actually make all that much money, due to being released in theaters at a weird time of the summer where not many people were going to the theater to begin with, and also the double bill issue. When thinking about it myself, I kind of thought maybe if I were in that position I would want to see My Neighbor Totoro first, and not Grave of the Fireflies first, simply because once you've seen Grave of the Fireflies, I don't think I could think about anything else after that. I know, like, My Neighbor Totoro would be a pick-me-up, right? But not really, because I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about what happened in Grave, particularly because My Neighbor Totoro takes place several years after the war, and I would be too busy thinking, like, these kids don't know! These kids just don't know, you know? Like, I think that would ruin it for me, but apparently my reaction is the opposite to the Japanese reaction. People whose theater screened Totoro first kind of knew what Grave was about, and after seeing Totoro left the theater because they didn't want to bring down their mood after seeing such a happy film. And people who saw Grave first tended to stay because they were just, you know, so rocked by the film that they had to sit and enjoy something, you know, sweet to kind of take the edge off of it. So I guess I'm alone in that camp. As such, My Neighbor Totoro was seen by a lot more people at the time than Grave, and probably still today a lot more people have seen My Neighbor Totoro than Grave of the Fireflies. And, you know, Totoro became a cultural icon, and we'll get into more of the reception of this double bill in the My Neighbor Totoro video, but for now, let's just focus on the graveness that is Grave of the Fireflies. The story revolves around a pair of siblings, Seita and Setsuko, who are living in Japan in the latter days of World War II, when their home is struck with a napalm bombing raid. Contrary to semi-popular belief, this movie has nothing to do with Hiroshima or the atomic bomb or any of that. Just incendiary bombings that were done routinely by fighter planes. Nothing to do with the atomic bomb. It really doesn't need to. It's pretty striking and sobering all by itself, just the attacks that do happen. And their mother is mortally wounded, and they have to go live with this really awful, mean aunt of theirs. And she's not like a... When I say awful, you kind of have to see the movie to see what... She's a very human kind of awful. She's an extremely believable and very tragic and understandable, but still awful. And so they decide they don't want to live with this terrible aunt, that they want to be able to take care of themselves. And I don't think I'm spoiling anything. You saw the first 5 seconds of the movie when I say that that doesn't go well for them. And so this story is semi-autobiographical, actually. The man who wrote it obviously survived to tell the story, but his sister did not. And when he wrote the story, he was largely apologizing for not being able to take care of her, and it's fun for the whole family, is what I'm saying. No, not really. It is a story about children suffering and dying during Japan's poor conditions during World War II, and it is 2 hours of that. Now let's break away from the sad stuff for just a minute to talk about the director, Isao Takahata. This is the first movie in the retrospective not directed by Miyazaki, certainly not the last. And Takahata has a very different style from Miyazaki, as in night and day. And I pick on Miyazaki a lot more, because he will be picked on later in the retrospective for some of the stuff that he does over and over where it's just overbearing and it's like, okay, stop. But honestly, I like him a lot more as a director than I do Takahata. That said, and I'll talk about his leanings as a director, that said, I think Grave of the Fireflies is by miles his best film. First of all, Takahata has always struck me as an extremely deep and weighty individual. Like, he likes comedy, but there's always a weight to everything he wants to create and wants to say. And the same could kind of be true of Miyazaki, but Miyazaki is a little bit more, I did this because I felt like it, and he's a little bit more of a visionary, and so, if anything, he's a bit more of a crabapple than he is weighty, if that makes any sense. And I'm not trying to diss Miyazaki. It is well documented that he's a crabapple. It's funny that he makes the movies that he does. But unlike Miyazaki, Takahata is not really a visionary, animation-centric kind of guy. He's sort of, the way he thinks and the way he writes and the way he presents things is sort of like a great novelist. He's extremely deep, and he's also very, very, very Japanese in his values and how he tells stories and what he tells stories about. All of his movies are extremely Japanese compared to Miyazaki's, who there's a lot of Japanese culture in them, but they're more universal and fantastically based. And Takahata, they're Japanese movies for a Japanese audience. So what do I mean Japanese movie? Well, classic Japanese cinema, there's some trends in it that I don't like and are in a lot of Takahata's movies, which is really heavy on the dialogue, really, really, really heavy on the narration, and it's sort of this experiential, is that a word? Experiential feel to it rather than a plot-based feel. And that's kind of like what Ozu films are like, and Takahata is not a lot like Ozu, but he reminds me a little bit of Ozu, and it's like, not my favorite thing in the world, but that doesn't peter into Grave at all. Grave is not monologue heavy, despite the fact it's actually being narrated a bit by a kid. He doesn't narrate. That opening line where he says, "This is the day I died," is pretty much the only thing he says, and the rest of it he's just sort of looking at everything, and you see the reactions on his face. And none of the other Takahata movies are like that, and I wonder if maybe the reason for that isn't that it was sobering enough that Takahata realized nothing should be said. Either that or it was due to the screenplay, but none of the rest of his movies are like that, and so you get this depth and power and weight that Takahata brings to things without that unfortunate Japanese trend of let's tell you everything and not shoot this very cinematically. So Miyazaki is definitely the more visionary filmmaker, but Takahata, when his movies lapse into the more cinematic and the less talky, his early two films in particular, not so much the later two films, he's more mature, I think. There's a depth and a power to his writing and to his presentation that Miyazaki doesn't possess, but he just doesn't have the same talent, visual talent that Miyazaki has, and I think enough of that. I should probably talk about the movie itself. First of all, this is the only Ghibli film that does not have a Disney dub and doesn't have any celebrities or anything like that. It was a Central Park Media effort. Central Park Media is a small company. They haven't put out great work, but it's honestly, for a dub, I have listened to it. It is actually pretty fine. It's passable. It's a little wooden, I guess, but for Central Park Media, it sounds great. That said, like, don't watch this movie in English. The point of the movie, you really should be watching this film in Japanese. It's just sort of... First of all, they cast actual small children as the... I know, it's terrible that they cast actual small children, and there is an effect you get when watching it in Japanese. It's not really the same as watching an English dub, and I think it's just sort of a... Even if it's a tiny matter of social responsibility, because this film is sort of an important film, you owe it to yourself to watch it in the original language. So I'm actually just going to say don't watch the dub, not for any quality reasons, but just, you probably just shouldn't. So I just said it was an important film, and that's, you get to the point there where people, like, want to find flaws with it. They want to tear it down. They want to say, well, this isn't beyond reproach just because everybody ever has given it a perfect score. They're just doing that because it's sad, or because, you know, like, what's so important about this movie? It's about a really sad event that took place, you know, whatever, those assholes, sorry, I don't mean it in serious, but I do kind of take umbrage with that point of view, because I do know a little bit more about the movie, and I think that the complaints about it being manipulative are total BS. Like, I saw once in a forum, this gent who, I don't know who he was or anything, but he compared stuff like Grave of the Fireflies to, like, Moe, to Clanad and Air and stuff that makes people cry, and I just kind of had to sit down for a minute and go, I'm not going to be angry at this guy, like, he doesn't mean it as far as he doesn't know what he's talking about, but why do I defend this movie so hard when in the past I have taken, like, important things, quote-unquote important works, like Evangelion, and just kind of not given a shit about their significance, even if I do admit that they were extremely culturally significant at the time and changed how anime was made? Why do I have, why do I have absolutely no patience for people taking issue with this movie? Well, if you recall, I mentioned that Takahata was an extremely deep individual. He's very thoughtful, he's got a lot of layers to him and to the things that he likes to write and to say. And this is not just about World War II. This is not, ooh, this happened and it was sad. That is not the point of this movie. The point of this movie is it was released at a time when juvenile crime in Japan was insanely high. And there was, I mean, just kind of terrible. And there was this big rift between the old generation and the new generation, and the lack of respect and the fear that the youth was going to take over the nation and ruin it, and then the youth was kind of thriving because they were in this bubble economy and they had lots of money and no time and absolutely zero respect for veterans as well as their parents, but particularly like veterans and people in the war. They figured they'd screw them over, and there's a lot of history to that I'm not really equipped to discuss in detail, but I know the basic strokes. I know that that's a lot of that is what Akira was addressing, weirdly enough, which is why I'm kind of weird about an American Akira movie being made, because to me Akira is such a Japanese thing. It is addressing Japanese issues from a specific time, and even though it's supposed to take place in the future and it has some universal themes, yes, for the most part, Akira was addressing an important thing in a time and place. And it's so abstract and weird that people don't really get that. In fact, they don't really understand what Akira is even about at all. Grave of the Fireflies, by contrast, takes the opposite approach and just says, to the youth of Japan, to the entitlement generation, do not isolate yourself, and do not badger the people who went through this to give you what you have now. Because again, the economy was fantastic at this time in Japan, and is very notable. The way that the film is presented and executed, he tried to paint Seita, the older brother, as the kind of kid that would be around at the time, actually. They kind of thought they were in complete control and screw the adults and that kind of thing, which Seita's not a rebellious kid, but there are parallels there. And at the end of the movie, one of the reasons I'm not talking about this movie stylistically is you just should see it. You really should. But at the end of the film, he and his sister, as ghosts, they are dead, look over the city of Japan, and it's brightly lit and all sparkly and prosperous, and it looks great, and everybody's rich, bubble economy, but the bright lights of the city are very similar to Fireflies, which has been a running motif throughout the movie. And the idea is that Fireflies are very temporary creatures. They live for a short time and then they die, and that's kind of what happens to the kids in the movie, and that's what happens to a lot of things that symbolize fire. The Firefly symbolism is totally just completely ingrained into the movie so hard it could not have a better title. And he is saying, as they look over the city, like, this will go away, and you need to focus on what's important. And that was just such a powerful thing to me, that he felt like it was his social obligation to say this to people in a way that wasn't preachy, and wasn't in people's faces, and was powerful and connected to a real thing that happened. That was really moving to me. So no, it is not about a sad thing that happened. It's about a message that turned out to be relevant, because guess what? That bubble burst. It kind of collapsed. He was right. Such things go away. And, I don't know. That concept of that movie being made for that purpose. It's not an anti-war film. Takahata has gone on record to say, this is not an anti-war film. This is not war hurts innocent children, because of course it does, but that's not what he was trying to say. A lot of what Seita does, the reason he and his sister die is his own fault, which is kind of a terrible thing, but it's true. And there's just so much weight and significance to this movie. It is one of the most important films that I think I've ever seen, and I don't know, I think it's just something that everybody has to see. And it's not fun to watch, and it does